So with that, let me invite our speakers of the session. First inviting our moderator, Mr. Ajit Pandit, Director and CEO of Indam Infrastructure Advisory Private Limited. Our speakers of the day, Mr. Anish J. Good to have him here, the Global Sector Head, Power and Utilities, KPMG. Mr. Inder Bhambr, Head Business Development and Sales, Envision. Mr. Mahesh Vipradas, Vice President, Sembcorp. And we have Mr. S.K. Chatterjee, he's joining us virtually, Chief Regulatory from the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. Are we connected with him? So I think till the time we establish the connect with him, we anyways start the session and I hand over to Mr. Pandit. Thank you.
Once again, a good morning and warm welcome to everyone on this very important session, Changing Regulatory Landscape. The growth of wind sector and renewable energy in India has been driven, as we know, with policy, conducive policy regime, as well as enabling regulatory framework, and that has been a case so far. But now going forward, particularly in the last couple of years, there has been a rapid change in the regulatory and policy regime and environment. And not only change, even the pace of this change is also astonishing at times. So what I'm going to actually do about is, just take you through, a couple of, important developments. And we have a very interesting and eminent panel and experts here with us. So I'm going to let them do a talking more. And just to give an idea about what are the changes, particularly in the last couple of years, and even amidst the COVID pandemic situation, and particularly last 2-3 years, we have seen kind of plethora of regulations of RTM operationalization, real-time market, the green term ahead market, green day ahead market, GDAM has been introduced. We are talking about REC and REC multiplier framework revamping. There is a GNA framework, General Network Access Framework, which has been talked about. There are storage policies, there are RTC tenders, and various policies that MOP has also come out with. And all this is going to have an impact and implications for the sector entities, and also presenting an opportunities for various stakeholders, whether it's RE developer or IPP or OEM, utilities, as well as system operators. Each one of us need to be actually aligning with this new regime that is getting unfolded for us. So in that sense, we have a pleasure of actually in our panel, in fact, representation of various stakeholder industry. We have from regulator, Dr. Chatterjee himself, who is architect of many of these regulations. We also have Anish Day, is very known personality in management consulting world and global head of KPMG energy utility practice. We also have Inder Bhambr on OEM representation, and they've recently won many 2 gigawatt turbine awards here. And we also have Mahesh Vipradas from representing IPP Sembcorp. So probably we'll have a various perspective which could bring it into a discussion forum. And before I hand it over to them or bring them into a discussion, just a couple of few facts and couple of statistics here. As we all know, we have reached renewable almost 30% of installed capacity base. Energy terms, it's still under 12%, 12-13%, so to speak. But particularly in terms of capacity addition for wind, since auction regime has been, the performance has been lackadaisical, I would say, compared to in last couple of years, and last year it's hardly, just above 1 gigawatt, so to speak. We have had award of about 16, or auction process for 16 gigawatt plus, out of which 13 gigawatt plus awarded, but commission is hardly 3.2 gigawatts. So clearly there is some gap, and there are also discussions about surrendering of some of these awarded contracts capacities as well. So there is a challenge which all of us have been recognizing, but at the same time, the golden lining is on the demand side, we have crossed as a country 201 gigawatt. There is an ambition spelled out about 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel capacity in the country, which has been talked about. So last 24 hours we have been discussing how do we actually make good of it. And more specifically for the wind, the optimal capacity mix of 2030, the numbers talk about 140 gigawatt. So what exactly we need to be when we see a on-ground reality as we stand today, at the same time 2030 or 2025 onwards, the future forecast. So what exactly, I'm going to pose the first question to our panel, and I don't know whether if you have Dr. Chatterjee now online available with us, or else we could start from here. First question would be, with the panel, 3 minutes each probably, what are the top 2 or 3 impediments, as they say it, for the scaling up of wind sector in India? And maybe I could turn to Mahesh first, if Dr. Chatterjee is going to take. Do we have Dr. Chatterjee available now? Not yet, okay. So probably we'll come back to him when he's available. But maybe we can start with you, Mahesh.
Yeah. Very good morning to all. Few important, I think 3 important factors that I see which resulted into around 1,000 megawatt capacity addition in the last year. One is, as the name shows of the discussion, changing regulatory landscape. So what happens is all the changes are affecting very greatly not only the renewable wind especially, and I will give you a few examples. And all these risk of changes are on the generator. For example, there is a change in the proposed DSM framework. That implication is on the generator. It's not he is not able to pass it on to the consumer. You may be aware there is a Supreme Court order on GIB. That implication the generator has to absorb. There are issues and regulatory delays on receivables. So that creates a problem or a doubt in the investor's mind. And we have now reached to a stage where already signed contracts where projects have been operational for a few years, these contracts are now being cancelled or threatened to be cancelled. And the process to stop that takes years and years, which basically impacts the investors' confidence in the, not in the sector or the demand of power, but on the regulatory structure that is available in the country, whether the structure is going to be there for next few years, or there are going to be sudden surprises which would come in, which has not been anticipated while conceiving the project or while bidding for the projects, especially in a very competitive environment where tariffs are now being pushed to a lowest level. So that is one. Second, the demand itself, because we have seen the bids have been completed and concluded, but the power supply agreements have not yet been signed with the DISCOMs. And that creates a huge problem, because I have closed a bid, finalized a tariff based on certain cost assumptions. If I have to keep waiting for start of the project for 6 months to 8 months to 1 year, those assumptions remain no longer valid, especially in the current volatile scenario where costs are changing almost every alternate day. So that risk is also on the generator. And third component I would think is in terms of transmission and land infrastructure. I think that is a tough nut to crack. Not from a regulatory perspective. I think since starting of the bidding in 2017, the regulatory portion of transmission, basically connectivity, long-term access, have been smoothened out, and it would continue to be worked upon. But the issue is actual transmission network availability on ground when the project becomes ready for commissioning. I think these are the three important aspects that I would think.
Thanks, Mahesh. I think it's really hands-on, not hand-burning, I would say. Sorry. Hands-on experience speaking for itself. So I turn to Anish, probably. You can talk a little bit about what, in your view, are important impediments and scaling up of wind.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. At the outset, I must admit that I don't have hands-on experience, so I must, defer to Mahesh for all of that. I envy that experience, actually. But if I had to just take a very different lens and abstract from the details of wind development and go to the broader aspect of why regulation is failing us and then come back to wind, then I think that might paint a wider picture for the problem which we have. The fundamental problem which we have is of irresponsibility. And I say that because most of our utilities don't feel obligated to serve the load that they have. It's not that we don't have perspective plans. You also mentioned that perspective plans are there. But what to do with those plans? If those plans are only intended for not meeting them, then they're not worth doing per se. So this is what is happening, that you have a need in a growing nation, and we heard earlier that, in the introductions, that we have turned from a power deficit nation to a power surplus nation. I can tell you that again we'll turn back to a power deficit nation very soon, much sooner than we think. And that's because we don't feel the obligation of serving load. We think that it's somebody else, the generator will set up. The generator won't set up or cannot set up for all the reasons which we are hearing from Mahesh and we have heard from others. So you have a situation where you have a growth in electricity demand which is quite strong. We saw 2 COVID years which were relatively muted, but now you're going to see 4 to 5% at least coming in from electricity, because all estimates show that our broader energy demand is going to grow at 3% per annum for a good 20-25 year period. And most of that being electricity. Actually, electricity growth requirement is going to be 4 to 5% minimum, irrespective of energy efficiency and all those good things which must happen. But then we don't have the framework for meeting that demand because we don't have capacity adequacy requirements. Okay, you are not obligated to meet capacity. You are not obligated as a utility to demonstrate that you have the reasons to meet, ability to meet capacity. It's just being talked about at this point of time in the policy circles that we must cast those obligations, and there has to be a demonstration of the ability to meet those requirements. So that's something which we should have started possibly along with the Electricity Act. Today, 20 years after the Electricity Act, we are still talking about that. Now, why does it affect wind more? Because if you see what is the composition of our mix happening, you can't build a thermal power plant again, and maybe 1 or 2, but you can't do it at scale. Okay, so you'll have retirals of thermal power plant as we go forward. What are we replacing it with? Solar. And I have nothing against solar because at least something is happening. But that's inadequate. And especially if you see at the times when you need capacity, not just the energy of it, the capacity. That's where you don't have that capacity coming up in the future. And wind could have provided a significant amount of capacity for that. But because we don't procure that way, we procure on least cost as a frame. We don't feel obligated to serve load. All this happens. So till the time, in bringing it to a close, this opening comments, till the time we cast that obligation to serve load, to plan adequately in advance and demonstrate that through regulations, that those plans are really up to the requirements, we will have this problem. It is not a wind problem. It's actually a much bigger planning problem.
Thanks, Anish, for actually bringing a very important point into a debate, and which is not just wind sector specific issue, but more of a wider sectoral issue. The resource adequacy framework and that mandate for the utilities, and in fact we have not debated that enough. And it's good that we are going to actually, I'm sure CERC is actually pursuing some of these innovative and interesting ideas and pushing the envelope on the regulatory scale. And we have now joined by Dr. Chatterjee. I hope you are able to hear us and can speak. We, just for your benefit, we just started the discussion about what are the key impediments for a scaling up of wind in the context. And we are discussing about, since the topic or theme or our debate is about the evolving and changing regulatory landscape. And particularly in the current last 2-3 years, CERC and then the General Forum of Regulators have come out with very innovative regulatory ideas. We've started RTM, we had GTM and GDAM. You're talking about now general network access, REC multiplier and RPO framework revamp. There are also storage guidelines and some of the things that you're working on. So a question to you is how do you see it? And obviously there's great amount of deliberations, thought process which goes into it. And in your view, how should the wind industry be looking at, or renewable energy in general, be looking at these regulations, and what are those opportunities? And maybe a thought process, you can elaborate on that, and also touch upon what you see as an impediments for the future growth. Over to you, Dr. Chatterjee.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope I am audible.
Yes, we can hear you well.
So good morning, everybody, and apologies at the outset for missing my esteemed colleagues and friends. It would have been nice to be there, sitting amongst you, but given my constraints, but good that Mahesh facilitated and then I could at least join virtually. So that's the advantage of the post-COVID era. And at least make sure that you are there either virtually or in person. So thanks a lot for inviting me. And I could basically take credit from what Mr. Anish just said. And the most important thing is the capacity value. I mean, what people generally look forward to is in terms of the capacity value of a value of any asset or any generation resource. But then there are inherent constraints in terms of the capacity value of any of the intermittent renewable energy sources, be it wind and solar. One has to live with it, but then there are ways to make sure that you overcome this constraint and bring for the stakeholders, especially the distribution companies who are your buyers, true capacity value. You serve their need and they need it. Because you have so many resources, and distribution companies, and mostly the public-owned distribution companies, have their own constraints in terms of procurement and procurement costs. So while at the center, at a larger level, we talk about the larger issue about climate change, energy security issues. But at the end of the day, what we have observed for the distribution companies, what matters is the monthly check that they have to draw and make payment to various sources of generation. So they quite often, and another important thing, and personally also I believe that you have renewable energy sources which are must be given a chance to inject whenever they are available. The basic logic is that the marginal cost of the generation of the renewables, especially wind and solar, is zero. So that's how it fits into your merit order as the first. That's the basic construct, but the counter argument often extended is that, see, at the end of the day, I have to, so if I have contracted contracted power from wind or solar at 5 rupees, 4 rupees or 350, for any generation that I take, I'll have to pay that. So that concept of marginal cost often does not resonate their ears. I mean, I'm saying, I'm just trying to give different perspectives, and that's where that resistance and also the intermittence, because of the intermittency, there is a load management issue, grid management issue, which creates irritation in the system. So having created this context, basically the effort that we have been, because see, at CERC, we are, we have the advantage of, listening to the viewpoints of the stakeholders on both sides. And there are competing demands. On the one hand, there are demands from the wind and solar industry for for greater incentives, greater support in terms of integration into the grid, and there are competing demands from the distribution companies in terms of addressing some of the concerns that I briefly mentioned in terms of the total cost versus the marginal cost, in terms of what you call the intermittency, there are problems in terms of load management, who bears that imbalance cost. It's often a fight between, RE-rich states versus non-RE-rich states, because at the end of the day, even if you are sitting in Kerala transmitting from Rajasthan, the Rajasthan has to bear that cost of imbalance in their own state. So there are constraints, there are issues. So for the regulators, the biggest challenge is of balancing these competing demands, and all the regulations that we are seeking to bring about might not really satisfy either the distribution companies or possibly the wind and solar industry in its entirety. And in fact, quite often people say that, I mean, if you have not been able to satisfy either, you have done a good regulation. So, so given these realities, in fact, efforts are on from the policy side as well as from the regulator side, trying to balance the interests of both and prepare the transmission system. Ultimately at the end of the day, you have to prepare the transmission system operation for large scale integration of wind and solar going forward. So for that, you possibly need to, bite bullets to start with. I mean, some of the measures that we have been trying to bring about might appear to be, might not really be, might not avoid all these stakeholders, especially wind and solar. But then one needs to look at these regulations in terms of the opportunities that they provide. And then the basic message that we have been trying to say is that all stakeholders need to bring in the desired discipline. And we are also at the same time creating market platform and market design for the stakeholders, especially the wind and solar, for them to take advantage of this. If you need to leapfrog, you need to explore your existence and presence in the context of the overall grid integration framework and the market design framework that we have been seeking to put in place. And in my opinion, going forward, if you have a look at these regulatory framework in this larger context, the speed of deployment possibly will be higher as we go along. I mean, that's the brief initial remarks. If you have specific questions, I can come back again. Over to you, Ajit.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Chatterjee, for putting that context and perspective in the initial setting. There are a couple of questions and the queries I'm sure I'll be talking on behalf of the probably audience here as well, raising those with the recent DSM regulations and ancillary regulations and how industry could, but we'll probably cover it in the next round of discussion. Let me turn to Inderji. While the regulations set out some kind of a context and kind of a visibility of rules within which the businesses should operate, as an OEM or as an industry sector participant, what are your three top key impediments for a kind of scale up? You have seen the industry growing at 5.5 gigawatt installations per year, and now we have seen in the recently just about touching 1.5 gigawatt is also a challenge. So how do you see on one side, this dichotomy between, and how do you expect from the policymakers and regulators to give this certainty and clarity? Three impediments in your view, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ajit. Good morning to all. Good morning to my fellow panelists and the elite crowd. Thank you so much to IWTMA and Windergy for having us as a company, Envision, and having me here on this panel. Many of us have been around for quite a while in the sector, and we've seen it really sort of come of age. And we had the earlier hiccups of the growth, etc., where because primarily the driver for this industry was not really generation of power and the quality aspect or the being a utility player, but it was driven by incentives on tax, etc. But we've really come a very long way, and today we have, the leading names of the world, whether they're utilities or whether they're IPPs funded by the largest private equity setups in the world. So there is no dearth of capital. I mean, it won't be an exaggeration to say that today we have capital lined up to set up not the 8 or 10 gigawatt that we are aspiring to do per annum to reach those, the milestone set by Honorable Prime Minister of the country, but we could go. It won't be an exaggeration to say that we can go double. So there is no dearth of capital. In terms of supply demand, while we take pride in saying that, okay, we are, now there's a balance or maybe there is a supply surplus, but we've seen what happened just when the summer began this year. And we were out of COVID and, the industries are, back with a vengeance. And we've seen shortages in power surplus states like Gujarat. So there is clearly demand. So there is demand for power. There is capital to deploy the generation capacity. And there is an intent of buying green power. And I don't think corporates of today's world are shying away from paying a premium for it. So where's the gap? And obviously all of us know where the gap is. And I think this has been discussed time and again. It is a conduit between, the generator and the consumer. And that unfortunately is restricted largely, through these PPAs. I think SECI's done a wonderful job. I can't be complaining about the government for coming up with, the competitive, the reverse auctions, etc., because that's the way forward. That's how you sort of build this whole setup. But I think there is this small glitch in between, and which unfortunately, and again, the state utilities have got their own reasons and challenges, etc. So, but of course, they need to come out of it. So there are a couple of things that we need to do. We try and streamline that. We try and, of course, bring in privatization. There has been a draft SBD which came up last year. That needs to be given the final shape. And had there not been a precedence of achieving success in that space, one could still imagine that, okay, there could be something, there's a major challenge to achieve it. We've seen at least a dozen circles which have got privatized. And many of these have not been easy circles. And credit to these companies which have gotten there and, for instance, like circles like Bhiwandi or Gaya, I mean, these are not easy circles to manage. And I can tell you the experience of these, the companies which have taken the lead in getting into, these, either the licenses which were awarded or there was some other mechanism to sort of privatize them. They've literally turned the whole situation overnight. The AT&C losses we know have come down drastically. I've known cases where, people thought that there are certain, users, which are not known to be most ethical. And that's where the challenge lies. And to our surprise, because I was associated with one such company, is that these very, consumers were actually highest consumers of powers. They had cold storages, which were extremely power-intensive industries. And they had diesel gensets, and in those years costing 15 rupees kilowatt hour. Today, probably it would be at maybe 25 rupees per kilowatt hour. So they just said to the, the new entrant that you give us assurance on 24/7, and you name the tariff and I'll pay you. Because he knew what is the extent tariff that can actually be, asked for. So I think we clearly need to follow that path. We need to get the, privatization in place. And we need to also look at alternate channel besides just routing through these long-term PPAs. So I think the couple of ways that we could probably look at it is that maybe one is that one simpler way of doing is that you give that opportunity to oversize for the IPP so that he can, besides meeting the long-term PPA, also, sell power in the open market. Second, maybe in the auctions itself, you can probably create a window of, let's say, a couple of hours in the morning, the peak hours basically. Because what you're expecting from an IPP is to sign a fixed tariff for the next 25 years. To be honest, can you imagine, I mean, if you really work out the NPVs and you just tweak the variables a little bit, every variable is so far stretched today that anything going wrong is going to be a disaster. So let him have an upside, let him have that flexibility of having these, 2, 3, or 4 hours a day, where over this period of 25 years, he can use the same capacity and create an upside. It'll drive him to have more consistent power. It'll drive him to bring in storage and some kind of mix, etc., give stability to the grid and get his own upside. Because if you don't bring that balance, we are headed for a disaster. So I think these are the couple of things. The third, as you know, the other elite speakers have also spoken of, is to sort of bring in the plug and play, because if you have to get anywhere close to this 400 or 500 gigawatt, it cannot run the way it is doing now, because you have all the IPPs rushing for the same auction, in the anxiety, achieving tariffs that they're achieving, then rush to the same, bunch of grid substations, the same parcels of land, and then create a chaos again. So I think maybe you don't have an overnight solution, but every state needs to bring in a plug-and-play model where the onus lies with him to get the land and the evacuation well in time. And obviously, this has to be done together with the other, agencies, etc., to call for tenders, etc., for evacuation. But that is a must. And without that, so we are not really, we are not headed the right way. Thank you.
Thanks, Inderji. I think you brought in very important points and solutions as well, discussing, challenges of competitive bidding framework, as well as, need for accessing market in more, effective manner, maybe through part merchant capacity or upsides kind of thing. So that brings me to a second strand of, discussion point for one more round is access to the market. And I'm conscious about the time, but so we'll try and club probably the two questions together. One is, what kind of reforms or modifications required in the current competitive bidding or e-auction framework, so to speak. And in that sense, we have seen probably a growth only concentrated around Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, as against earlier all-round RE states of 8-9 wind states that we have seen earlier. There are discussions about state-specific bids. There are discussions about, race to the bottom to be awarded. We could have some kind of a floor. So some of these ideas, so what kind of amendments, modification in the bidding framework or a policy regime which is required, that is one part. On the other, and second part is looking beyond a long-term PPA, whether access to the market or merchant power or part merchant capacity, and what is the regulatory regime currently, how it enables it. Probably we'll start with Dr. Chatterjee and can talk about probably an ancillary and the GTAM and GDAM and what are the avenues that regulator has opened up for access to the market and for RE participation in the market. Dr. Chatterjee, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, there are, plethora of regulations that we have come up with in the recent past. So I don't think time would permit for me to touch upon each of those regulations, but some of the important enablers in terms of regulation, true regulations that we are wanting to bring or have brought about. I would start with general network access, because you are talking about the access. This concept of GNA, this is a game changer. In fact, what we are trying to say in through this framework of general network access is that as a generator, you don't need to bother about payment of transmission charges. What we have said is that at the end of the day, it is the beneficiaries or the distribution companies who are going to bear that cost implicitly or explicitly. So in the new scheme, we have said that it's the distribution companies who would bear that cost based on the general network access that they get, and for the generators. And this is a big enabler for the RE, especially wind and solar, because they can compete only based on their own levels of efficiency and price competitiveness, and without bothering about the transmission charges in the new regime. Discoms have some reservations, but then we are working on it, trying to resolve this. But then the first point is that this is going to create, and also what we are saying is that once a Discom has general network access, say of 2,000, 5,000 or 10,000 megawatt, within that it will have complete freedom of contracting power, either long term, medium term or short term. So what we are saying is that basically we are trying to encourage merit order dispatch through this kind of a mechanism. This will be a big relief for the wind and solar, especially the big industries. And the other market framework, we have the second important point that I would like to mention is about the real-time market. Or rather, going forward, that's the basic message that I wanted to convey through my opening remarks as well, that going forward, you should lean on the market framework and market design more, rather than leaning on, I agree, on a very longer term comfort giving power purchase agreement for 25 years. Of course, that could be one, but then one can conceive of, these concepts of virtual power plants coming up. I mean, those plants can go and participate in the day ahead market and correct their position in the real time market. And then, in fact, the balancing cost also will get absorbed significantly if you can have a framework like that. So the real-time framework that we have brought in, apart from this access issue, is also going to be a big enabler where the renewables, especially wind and solar, can leverage on. And third, possibly, as I said, the list is quite long, the ancillary services framework, because, at the end of the day, you need a balancing framework, because right at the outset, I mentioned that intermittency of wind and solar is inherent. You cannot completely do away with it, but then you can manage that through deployment of ancillary services, through better utilization of these market instruments like your day-ahead market, and then correcting your position in the real-time market. I am not going into details in terms of other market products like integrated GDAM. There are several avenues which you have. So what possibly is the way forward is one project having multiple portfolios, in terms of, instead of 100 megawatt plant coming up and entering into a 25-year contracts for that entire 100 megawatt capacity, one can make use of these current frameworks and have part capacity in the merchant mode, or playing into the market, part through the integrated GDAM, part participating in the ancillary services framework as well as you go along. I mean, if you can combine with the battery storage. But I'm conscious of the constraint of time and will hand it over to you, Ajit. I can go on, but then, yeah, over to you.
Yeah. I think Dr. Chatterjee, I think you had given a plethora of options which is available, and it's very heartening to know the regulatory, forward-looking regulations that is being talked about. So I'll turn to you, Anish. Actually, Dr. Chatterjee has laid the path for the regulatory evolution and framework. But how do you see a future of market in that sense, and how renewable could take advantage of the market conditions, or maybe a international experience, or like to touch upon the future scenario painters for us?
Right. So I think renewables are also getting diverse. Even within wind, you'll have offshore wind, which will have to come. So let me just walk back a little. We're talking of 500 gigawatts as the target. But if you had to look a little longer, because of what I mentioned, that India is going to grow for the next 20, 25 years at pretty relentless pace. So you're actually talking of 1,500 gigawatts. So to that extent, you are looking at a very, very large renewables-driven market. And transmission lines and everything will crisscross because of the nature of the thing. What you can't do is get to a very administered mechanism for such a large sector. So you have to get back to what Dr. Chatterjee was saying, you have to get to much more market-driven frameworks. And to that extent, the developer or the financier will also have to take comfort from that market-driven framework. Today, do they have that comfort? They don't have that comfort. But then we need to look at how do we find a middle path for this. So if you have an asset life which is 25 years, if you want comfort for all 25 years, possibly people will struggle, especially with the change given negative prices coming in during the day for solar in particular, people will struggle. But if you give a kind of hybridize some of those, say you have there are two parts to it. One is the offtake, the second is the price. Any contract has two parts. So if you can say that, by this I'm ensuring that offtake will happen, but your price certainty happens only for that period of debt, say 12, 13 years. After that, you have the upside and the downside depending on market prices. So your pricing is going to depend on the market. So some form, we have to find innovation which is market-driven while meeting the needs of the lenders and the developer, which means that the length of the contract can be long enough, but the mechanism must be much more nuanced and much more market-driven as compared to others, so as compared to earlier. So that's one point. The second point, again, as Dr. Chatterjee said, is that the ability to chisel positions continuously is very, very important, because that is an essential risk management instrument. And I'm not getting into financial instruments because those also will help in that position. But essentially, even for the physical product, continuously rebalancing your portfolio is going to be very, very important. And that's where the intraday markets, the ancillary services markets, and RTM all become very important. We have the concepts in place, but we need to scale up and strengthen those. And we also need to create capability and obligation on part of the off-takers also to kind of equally participate in that, because you can't clap with one hand. So that's where we need a fair amount of bump up in market-driven activities. So, but kudos to CERC for all the good work which has been done on that.
Thanks, Anish. I think you brought in very interesting insights into how the future contracting and arrangement and more towards a market mode one need to look at, and that's that. So I turn to Mahesh on the competitive bidding framework. I think there are a couple of thoughts that are coming up into discussion. What exactly are your suggestions on in terms of if you have to suggest to a policymakers revamp or review of competitive bidding or auction framework as of now? And so what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing is clear since long is we are not going back to the feed-in tariffs. That has been made very clear. So in the given situation, are we really have to do this case one bidding only, which is done by the implementing agency, mostly SECI and NTPC, etc. The format of e-reverse auction. See, the problem is coming because from the date of closing of bid till actually starting the project is the area where most of the risk is now coming in, because this period is getting longer and longer, and in this period the transmission that I have planned for may get exhausted. The cost that I had planned for may not be available in the market. So one is right, and now what can be tweaked in this existing one before we go into a larger discussion of alternate bidding mechanisms. So in this case, one option is I don't do a next round of bid till I close the PSAs for the existing bids. But I think that is not being looked at favorably, because they want to see how much capacity can be bidded out, and those numbers are also equally important. So now can we look at, if it is getting more than 6 months, can you have the tariff gets indexed to the steel and cement prices? Because I cannot, as an IPP, cannot keep on waiting for the off-taker to sign agreement with SECI with my costs frozen 6 months back. And it's not a new idea as far as indexation of tariff is concerned. It has been used by CERC as well as MERC in Rajasthan in a slightly different context. But indexation of tariff with some commodity indices has already been done. So immediate tweak which can help people to wait or be patient during this period would be this. Second is, then can we look at kind of a case 2 kind of bidding where the land, infrastructure, etc., is available. Maybe we cannot switch from one to other, but maybe we can have some of one and some of two. So that would help in a bigger way. And I think after having the GNA in place, for the same project, I would look at portfolio so that I would not entirely depend on the bidding mechanism. So these are 2 or 3 suggestions that I have on the bill.
Interesting, Mahesh. So apart from the bidding, probably Inderji, you can also give your suggestion on the bidding part, but also want to bring in on specific issue about, as we are discussing large-scale renewable integration to the grid, what is it that the turbine technology advancements, that intelligent turbine or smart turbine, and how does basically the grid operators also are going to demand more and more from the turbines in terms of voltage support, reactive support, and other stuff. So how would the regulations could actually guide, or other way around the technological advancement could actually drive some of this regulatory enhancement? So would you like to touch upon on that something intelligent turbine and other aspects that you are doing or advancement that you are trying to bring in here?
Yeah, certainly. I think enough has been spoken on the auctions regime, and I think there is a fair bit of alignment amongst all the speakers as to how we need to go about changing that to an extent possible. In terms of the technology, you know, a couple of things have happened. One is that, you know, the turbines have got far more advanced from earlier. And second is the grid has become stronger and, you know, more stable because we're connecting at higher voltage levels now. So, you know, the basic elements of HVRT, LVRT is sort of become a norm now, and I think every OEM has got sort of adapted to that. There are certain other elements like, you know, the power control, which is basically around harmonics. So in that also there is, I think, enough advancement within the turbine. So I don't think there is any technical challenge per se within this wind turbines to align to the requirements of grid. And in terms of making the turbines more intelligent, yes, we are taking lead in that as a company. And we have AIoT-based, you know, analytical solutions. These are all, you know, coming through our digital platform. And so our turbines are getting more and more intelligent, and to take care of its own health, and also to sort of give, you know, warnings of any kind of changes that you may potentially require, not just from its own performance perspective, but also in terms of aligning to, let's say, the change in voltage levels or frequencies, or, you know, reactive power, you know, requirements, because that's a very subjective element. Reactive power, really, the requirements change from, you know, substation to substation. And so there is, you know, work happening in that space. So I think in terms of technology, there are no constraints per se, whereas, you know, the turbines are getting more and more intelligent.
Thanks. So I'm conscious of time, but we still have probably, before I turn to our audience for the questions, one definitely a thought which I don't want to leave this panel without discussing is about new business areas or new segments which have been talked about is offshore wind and the repowering. So maybe I can pick up, let's maybe first turn to Dr. Chatterjee, because in the RE tariff, and these are both new ideas we have talked about, probably regulations do enable it in the form of project-specific tariff. So what are your thoughts about what kind of interventions of regulatory interventions which are possible for offshore wind, facilitated offshore wind, as well as repowering some of these concepts? Maybe two quick pointers on that, Dr. Chatterjee.
Yeah, I mean, as you rightly mentioned, we have, see, when you can't have a generic tariff for these technologies, I mean, because they are emerging, we had faced similar situation when solar was introduced. And in fact, we initially thought in 2009-10 that we'll go in for project-specific tariff, but then people pressed on having a generic tariff we did come up with. But I think the scale that was possible for solar, similar thing might not really be possible on these fronts, especially offshore wind. This is something which must be harnessed, but initiative first must come from the government side by extending some, you know, SOPs on because they have to possibly provide some incentives and subsidies on different counts to make this happen, some pilots. But in that process, if that comes before us, we will be happy to examine and have already created an enabling framework for a project-specific tariff to start with. And we look forward to some of the projects or petitions coming before us, for us to also learn and understand as to how we can tweak our own regulations to further push these new and emerging technologies. That's it.
Mahesh, probably, you know, I'll first go to Mahesh and then come back to you on this. You'll have to, from industry side, specific asks on the repowering and offshore wind you want to talk about? Or challenges of these two developments or business segment?
Repowering, I think, has been being discussed. Now, I think we're getting into a time zone where repowering would actually be possible. Why I say is, now we have been 12 years from 2009, 2010. That is the period where large projects, large size of individual wind projects were commissioned. 25 megawatts, 55 megawatts, a single project. So, because to me, the basic hindrance in repowering was the fragmented ownership prior to 2005, where individual turbines were owned by individual different generators, and basically bringing them all together in terms of land, their individual PPAs or offtake arrangements. Now we are entering into the time where we could have large size projects which could be single chunk can be repowered. So I think that is where we are now. We should be able to do that. Some kind of tweaking in terms of transmission, in terms of tariffs may be required, but I think that's not a very big problem to solve. Coming to offshore, as Dr. Chatterjee has mentioned, it will require some kind of a support, maybe initially actually a grant or subsidy, because unlike onshore wind, which started in a very small way, 1 turbines, 2 turbines, unfortunately we can't do that in offshore. So to have a 100 megawatt plus kind of a project, that support in the initial years is definitely required. The ways can be, I mean, the support can always be offered through a competitive way. That possibility is always there, like the VGF which was done. But I think that would be required in case of offshore. Plus, going forward with the kind of price sensitivity that the DISCOMs are showing now, I'm still not sure about the acceptability of offshore by the procurers. Thank you.
Thanks. Anish, your views on offshore wind, particularly as point that Mahesh is mentioning that onshore wind itself is struggling. So where is the business case for offshore wind and why we should look at offshore wind compelling, and you have been working on probably talk about
So I go back to my original point that we might bask in the glory of surpluses at this point of time. It will change very soon. And if it changes, we won't have the tools to deal with it. And offshore wind then becomes a pretty important tool. So it's a question of timing, This conversation will look very different when we have it 3 years down. Now, offshore wind is expensive, but it's also a very different ecosystem because it's mostly, if you see that, it has more, similarities with offshore oil field development as compared to wind development. Okay, so that is the thing to remember. And it's very expensive, just like offshore oil field development is very expensive. So what is important is to give a clear picture about the size of the market, because if you give that picture of the size of the market, then you potentially can have experienced players coming in and working on that space. If that experience which is available in Europe is not available, I'm being told to shut up, but I'll just take a minute more. So if you can't bring that experience, then the costs will remain high. So we have to give that market visibility to have those players come in and take the lessons from Europe and elsewhere, bring them into India. The second is on the infrastructure, associated infrastructure. Now, this will require transmission lines of a different category and different scale. Now, that visibility also has to be there because any mistiming of that is going to be absolutely disastrous. So that's the second point I would make. And the third point I would make is that we might have VGF, or whatever, but it has to be a competitive process, because in maybe 1 or 2 projects on a project-specific basis, okay. But eventually, we have to quickly transition to a competitive process, because otherwise, it's not acceptable in today's world.
Just quick points on the offshore wind, Inderji.
Yeah, I think offshore, I'm aligned with the 2 speakers. If I can take the liberty of just taking one step forward and talking about a third element, because I think time has come now that we have power islands producing green hydrogen and green ammonia. It's already being done elsewhere in the world. So you could probably have, let's say, a 2 gigawatt project which is self-sustaining. You build the wind turbines, solar, and the storage there. You use the grid to charge the turbines, etc. Then you cut off, you form an island, and you keep producing green hydrogen and green ammonia. And this setup acts as an excellent backup when the grid needs you. I mean, you continue to do a good job of producing, hydrogen and ammonia, but that's not like, that's not sometimes, the question of a lifeline. But the grid sometimes might require this immediate, pumping in of power. And this island can then act as a backup and really do that for you. So I think that's one element that we need to clearly, think about and, try and form regulations around it and get the, parties interested to implement that.
Thanks. I'm aware we're totally run out of time, but just last maybe one or two questions from the audience, if there are any burning questions to the panel. Yeah, Taneja ji.
Good morning, everybody. See, states are not ready or they are not obligatory to listen to the MNRE guidelines and other things. To mitigate this, I think in 2015, Renewable Energy Act was initiated, a draft is still pending. That in some way or the other may take care of the things what wind industry needs at the moment. Say renewable energy policy was also added in 2020 amendment, but that also has been withdrawn. And original Electricity Act, there is hardly anything which favors the renewable energy. So what are your views on this, that should we get this Renewable Energy Act into force or not?
So to anyone in particular on the panel, or let me just check with the fellow panel, or maybe Dr. Chatterjee.
I think nobody better than him. Absolutely.
You're on mute, Dr. Chatterjee.
Sorry, yeah. No, my brief reaction is like this, that if Act were to be a panacea for all the ills, possibly we would not have any ills in the power sector post the enactment of the Electricity Act 2003. There are so many good and ideal conditions which have been created through the Electricity Act 2003, including for promotion of renewable. I mean, of course, there are more that one could possibly expect in the Electricity Act 2003, but then there are adequate provisions either in the Electricity Act 2003 or through the policies, National Electricity Policy and Tariff Policy, which flow from the Electricity Act 2000, and also the regulations also which flow from the Electricity Act 2003. So they have been put in place, but then the issue is about that ecosystem, the resistance and several, competing demands of the stakeholders. I mean, in my personal opinion, only an enactment of a new law in the form of an RE Act really cannot resolve the burning issues that we discuss, through this entire session. You need, good intention, you need understanding on both sides of the stakeholders to make things happen. If a new act comes, it's fine. I mean, I'm not averse to that idea, but I'm saying that I personally have a very long experience of the legislation making process, the intent that goes behind that, and the implementation as well. So I combine in myself almost all these three. So that's what my personal opinion is, that what is really important is both stakeholders on both sides to come together and understand each other and move forward within the construct that you already have, instead of harping on a completely new legislation in the form of an RE Act. Over to you, yeah. I think
Anish,
I can't but stand in for Amit Kapur, who's not here because he's in Supreme Court. And I must say that, we are terrible at framing new legislation, and I've seen multiple drafts of the new legislations which have come. They're all terrible. Okay, so best avoid it, because if you have new acts, it'll more complicate the problem than solving it. So let me provoke a thought on that, or opinions on that. Going on to the Electricity Act, that was one exception, because it was a kind of a Rolls Royce of an act, and it was just a fantastic thing. You can do most things which you want to do under the act. You don't need separate legislation for that, including on renewable energy, as Dr. Chatterjee is saying. The only thing which it did not do is to rid us of this agency problem which we are sitting for time immemorial. Okay, so if you can rid us of this the agency problem, and if we can get an act for that, I think that's the only one which is required. The rest of it is all there.
Yeah, I think with those words, probably we can conclude, unless there is a last burning question.
Ajit.
I'm pointed that we need to really close.
Ajit, just before that, just one line. I asked a senior advocate, and I obviously will not name him, about having 2 acts covering basically the same area. And can we do that? He says, yes, yes, you should do it. It would be a lawyer's delight.
So we'll just conclude this session by thanking all the, my fellow panelists for wonderful session and interactions out here. I think there is hardly anything to summarize in a way. We generated so many ideas. I would request organizers to just collate this, and that's the action plan for work in progress and continuum. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful interaction. May I request Mr. Pandit also to present the mementos to our speakers.
Dr. Chatterjee will can't pass it on virtually over here.
Thanking Mr. Anish Day. Thank you. Thanking Mr. Mahesh. Thanking Mr. Bhambr. And I request Mr. Gurunathan to kindly present the memento, expressing our thanks to our moderator, thanking Mr. Pandit. If I can request all the speakers for a group photograph, and with that we close the session.